Nobody asked her to dance. Not the man who borrowed her notes twice. Not the stranger who made eye contact from across the room. Not even the one person in that ballroom who had held her hand through the worst weeks of her life before deciding that the easier version of his life did not include her. 300 people in the most expensive hotel ballroom in Chicago. A live orchestra. Chandeliers worth more than most people's houses. And Soleil Diane Mercer sat alone at a table near the edge of the dance floor with her hands in her lap and a pressed flower in her pocket that she had been carrying for 4 years. Nobody knew about the flower. Nobody knew about the boy who had given it to her without meaning to. And nobody, not one person in that room, knew what was about to happen when a young man from Englewood in a suit he had ironed himself walked through the door. The morning Kendrick Jerome Wallace arrived at Harwick University, he took a bus from Englewood to a neighborhood that looked like a different country. Not a different city, a different country. He stepped off the bus with one duffel bag and a backpack and stood in front of the most expensive private university in Illinois for a long moment. The building alone looked like somewhere important decisions were made. He adjusted the strap on his backpack and went inside. The lobby was flowers and chandelier light and parents wearing watches that cost more than his mother made in a year. He found the registration line and stood in it with his paperwork in a manila envelope he had organized the night before and checked 3 times on the bus ride over. He was in the right place. He was not sure he belonged in it. The girl in the wheelchair was at the registration desk to his left. He did not stare. Darlene had raised him better than that. But he noticed her the way you notice someone who is being very carefully not noticed by everyone around them. People stepping around the chair without eye contact, talking past her, moving through the space like she was furniture in an inconvenient location. She was looking straight ahead. Her face was composed in the way of someone who had learned that showing anything costs more than it returns. Then one of the tall flower arrangements beside her desk shifted slightly and a single flower fell. It landed on the floor between them. Kendrick bent down and picked it up. He held it out to her. She looked at it, then at him. "Thank you." Quiet, almost surprised. Like the word had caught her off guard. "Of course." He turned back to his envelope. The line moved forward. 30 seconds. He forgot about it before he reached the desk. She did not forget. That evening Soleil pressed the flower in the back of her architecture textbook. She sat at her desk in her freshman dorm room and smoothed it flat between 2 pages and told herself it was nothing. It was just a flower. It was just a boy who bent down and picked something up off the floor without making it into a moment. That was the thing. He had not made it into a moment. She had been in enough interactions since the wheelchair arrived to know what making it into a moment looked like. The performance of normalcy, which was its own kind of announcement. The careful helpfulness that was really about managing the helper's discomfort. The kindness that required an audience or at least an acknowledgement. She could read all of those in the first 2 seconds now. She had learned to read them the way you learn to read weather, not analytically, just as a felt sense, automatic and accurate. He had bent down and picked up the flower and held it out and turned back to his paperwork. Like the action was self-evidently the right action and required nothing further. Like she was simply the next person in the line and he was simply the person who bent down when something fell. She did not know his name. She did not know his story. She knew nothing about him except 30 seconds of his behavior, which was apparently enough. She pressed the flower and closed the book. Her name was Soleil Diane Mercer. She was 19 years old and the only daughter of Warren Mercer, CEO of Vertex Capital Group, Chicago's largest private infrastructure conglomerate. Her father was worth $2.3 billion. He owned the most expensive fleet of cars and boarded planes to attend meetings in the cities where decisions were made, and had spent the last 3 years making sure every door around Soleil was held open before she needed to reach for it. He had never once asked her what she actually needed. She was studying architecture because she had decided early on that the built world was broken in ways most people never noticed because most people never had to. She had been in enough public buildings since the wheelchair to know that accessibility was almost always the last thought. A ramp jammed beside a staircase, an elevator tucked behind a service entrance, a bathroom with a door just barely wide enough if you approached it at exactly the right angle. She was going to build differently. She was going to build from the wheelchair up. Not just for herself. The overlooked, the excluded, the ones whose needs arrived last on every planning document because the people writing the documents had never had to think about them. She had not danced since before the diagnosis. Not because she could not. She could move her upper body, her arms, her shoulders. She had rhythm. She had grown up dancing in her father's kitchen on Saturday mornings when he was in a good mood and the radio was on. She had not danced because in 3 years nobody had asked. She closed the architecture textbook with the flower pressed inside it and put it on the shelf and went to bed. She kept the flower. Kendrick's father, Thomas, had been a carpenter. Not the weekend hobbyist kind. The kind of carpenter with hands that knew with the way musicians know their instruments. By feel, by memory, by something passed down through years of practice that went deeper than instruction could reach. He built furniture, cabinets, bookshelves, staircases, whatever people needed. He had a small workshop in the back of the house in Englewood where he kept his tools organized with the precision of someone who understood that a good tool treated well could last a lifetime. Kendrick used to sit in that workshop as a kid and watch him work. He wasn't helping because he was too young to be useful. So he just watched. The way his father's hands moved over wood. The way he would stop and run his thumb along a grain before deciding how to cut it. The complete focus of a man who was good at something and knew it and did not need anyone to tell him so. He worked 6 days a week. Sometimes 7. Not because he loved the grind of it, but because the work was there and the family needed it, and Thomas Wallace was not the kind of man who looked at a need and walked past it. That was simply not the kind of man he was. He died of a heart attack when Kendrick was 11 years old. His heart simply gave out. Too much work, too many years, a body that had been asked to carry too much for too long. He was 41. Kendrick had been sitting in math class when the school office called him to the front desk. He walked down the hallway not knowing yet what he was walking toward. The squeak of his sneakers on the linoleum, the classroom sounds falling away behind him, was the last moment of the life he had before. He thought about that walk more than he thought about most things. His mother Darlene had been doing every kind of work available for as long as Kendrick could remember. Cleaning offices, scrubbing toilets in office buildings in the Loop, mopping floors in lobbies where people in expensive suits walked past her without registering that she was there. She left before 5 in the morning and came home after the boys were asleep. She had been doing this for 22 years without complaint, without asking for recognition, and without once suggesting to her sons that the world owed them anything it was not already giving them. What she did suggest every single day in the way she got up and went out and came home and got up again was that you showed up. That was the whole lesson. You showed up when it was hard. You showed up when nobody was watching. You showed up because not showing up was not something the Wallaces did. Kendrick had been showing up his whole life. He had won the full scholarship to Harwick through 2 years of applications and essays and interviews and a civil engineering portfolio that one of the selection judges later described as the most original undergraduate work she had seen in a decade. 1 scholarship. He earned every dollar of it. At Harwick he was tolerated. Not included. His clothes were wrong. His neighborhood was wrong. His name sounded wrong in the mouths of people whose names were on buildings. He was never invited to a single party in 4 years. He went to every class and ate alone in the campus cafeteria more times than he could count, sometimes sitting next to people who had stopped seeing him the way you stop seeing furniture that has always been in a room. He noticed, but he was not bitter about it. He was something more dangerous than bitter. He was clear-eyed. He understood exactly what was happening and had decided a long time ago that their failure to see him was not going to become his failure to become something. At night, in his apartment, he drafted infrastructure proposals for communities like Englewood. He studied the budget allocations for road resurfacing across Chicago's neighborhoods over the last 15 years and mapped the pattern precisely. Who got the money early, who got it late, who kept getting deferred. The neighborhoods on the south and west sides consistently received the worst version of everything the city built, and the gap had been widening, not narrowing. He was going to change that. He thought about Thomas every time he sat down at his desk at night. His father had built things with his hands. Kendrick was going to build things with his mind. And he was going to build them for the place that had made both of them, the place that kept getting the city's leftovers while other neighborhoods got its best work. Englewood was not going to be a line item on someone else's deferred list for the rest of his life. That was what 4 years at Harwick had been for. Not the degree. Not the credential. The work he had been doing quietly while everyone around him had been doing other things. The gala was going to be the last night he was invisible in that place. One way or another, it was going to be the last night. The end of freshman year came in April. Soleil woke up on a Tuesday morning and her legs felt strange. Not painful, just distant, like signals being sent to a part of her body that had decided to stop receiving them. She told herself it was nothing. She had an early studio class and a model due at noon, and she did not have time for nothing to be something. By Thursday, she could not move them. The diagnosis was transverse myelitis, inflammation of the spinal cord that had arrived without warning, without cause, without anything she had done to invite it. Her immune system had simply turned against her spine one ordinary week in April. It happened to otherwise healthy young people. The doctors explained it with the specific gentleness of people who have learned that medical accuracy does not reduce devastation. She lay in the hospital bed the night of the diagnosis and stared at the ceiling and thought about all the buildings she had ever walked into. Every library, every lecture hall, every restaurant and concert hall and hotel lobby. She had never once thought about how they were designed. She had just moved through them. They had been built for a body like the one she used to have. She called her father from the hospital room. Warren arrived in 45 minutes, which was as fast as his driver could get him there from his downtown office. He came in still in his suit from the morning's meetings, slightly out of breath from moving faster than he usually moved, and sat down beside the bed and took her hand and looked at her with the expression of a man who had spent 30 years solving problems and was realizing with gathering terror that this one was not solvable. He said he was going to fix this. He could not fix this. That was the first time in Warren Mercer's adult life that money could not solve the problem in front of him. He did not know what to do with that. So he did what he always did when he was afraid. He controlled the environment. The best spinal specialists in the country. A rehabilitation facility with a staff ratio that no insurance plan covered. Every door opened before she needed to reach for it. Every obstacle removed before she needed to encounter it. Nobody asked Soleil what she actually needed. The hardest part was not the logistics. Warren had covered all the logistics. The hardest part was learning that the world had not been built for her. That she had spent 19 years moving through spaces designed around the assumption that everyone in them moved the same way. And now she was the person who revealed the assumption. Not by saying anything, just by existing. Just by arriving in rooms that had been built for a different version of a body and watching the gap between where she was and where the design had put the door. She got a wheelchair and a father who meant well and a boyfriend who was about to fail the most important test of his life. His name was Trey. They had been together for 14 months before the diagnosis. He was funny and present and the kind of person who paid attention to things, which was what she had liked most about him. He came to the hospital every day for the first 2 weeks. He held her hand. He sat beside the bed and talked to her about ordinary things, the classes she was missing, the show they had been watching together, plans he was already making for when she got out, and the ordinariness of it was a kindness. He was not making her condition the only thing in the room. He was treating her like a person who had a condition, not a condition that used to be a person. She thought he was going to be fine. She thought they were going to be fine. Then the weeks stretched into a different shape. The wheelchair arrived. The reality of what the future looked like settled around both of them like weather that was not going to change. Trey did not leave dramatically. He did not have a conversation where he explained himself or gave her something to point to later as the exact moment. He just gradually stopped. Calls got shorter. Visits got further apart. Responses took longer and then took much longer and then stopped arriving at a reliable frequency entirely. And then one day he simply was not there anymore. No goodbye. No explanation. Just the slow, careful erosion of someone choosing the easier version of their life over the harder version of loving someone through something difficult. It was the specific cowardice of a person who is not cruel enough to say the thing directly and not brave enough to stay. Soleil never heard from him again. She took a year away from Harwick. She went home to her father's house and she rebuilt herself. Not the version she had been before, because that version was gone, but a new one. A version that knew things the old one had not known. She learned to read rooms instantly. She learned the difference between kindness that costs the giver something and kindness that is just performance. She learned that the people who stayed were worth more than the people who performed staying. She returned to Harwick the following year as a sophomore. Trey was still around. Not at Harwick, somewhere in the city, living the easier version of his life. She did not think about him often. She thought about him mostly when she was in a room that was about to prove her right about something she had been trying not to believe. Across the remaining 3 years they existed in the same spaces without ever really occupying them together. A nod in the library, passing in a hallway between classes. One afternoon they were both in the campus cafe at the same time. 12 feet apart, different books, different thoughts, never a word. Soleil's thesis project gained dimension in her junior year. The community center designed from the wheelchair up, built for Englewood because Englewood was the neighborhood the city kept deciding was someone else's problem. The place where layered exclusions compounded. Race, income, infrastructure, neglect, the invisibility of people the city built around instead of for. Her professors called the work transformative. Her classmates barely knew it existed. At Harwick she was still mostly Warren Mercer's daughter. The girl in the wheelchair. The one who had that situation. She did not tell anyone about the pressed flower. She did not carry it every day. But on the days she expected to be looked through, on the days she walked into rooms that had already decided what she was and was not, she put it in her pocket. Not as a talisman. As a reminder that 30 seconds of ordinary decency had once existed and had been real and had been hers. It had happened. She had not imagined it. He thought about Soleil occasionally. Not often. Just when he passed her in a hallway and remembered the look on her face when she said thank you 4 years ago. The specific quality of surprise in it, like she had expected a different reaction and was recalibrating. She remembered the flower every time she saw him. It was still in the back of her architecture textbook, pressed flat, holding its shape across semesters and moves and the general wear of 4 years. She had never been able to explain to herself why she kept it. The closest she could get was this. In 3 years of people arranging their faces and performing their kindness and managing their discomfort around her, he had been the one person who just handed her something and kept walking. Like there was nothing remarkable about it. Like she was simply the next person in the line and he was simply the person who bent down. Neither of them said anything across 3 years. There was no framework for it. The flower stayed in her textbook. Kendrick was not going to attend the graduation gala. He sat in his apartment that afternoon with his suit on the hanger and his shoes by the door and thought about all the reasons not to go. In 4 years, he had not been included in a single social event at that university. The gala was for the people whose names were already in the program, whose parents had given buildings and whose futures had been decided before they arrived. He had planned to skip it, change out of his graduation robe, drive to Darlene's apartment on the south side, sit at her kitchen table and tell her he had done it. Then his phone rang. Darlene's voice came through with the particular steadiness she used when she was saying something she had been holding for a while. He told her he was thinking of skipping the gala. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your father used to say you should always show up to the last day of anything. Because the last day is the one people remember. Not as pressure. Just as information. Something she was passing along because it belonged to him." Kendrick sat with it. He picked up the iron. The graduation gala was held in the grand ballroom of the Harwick Hotel on Michigan Avenue. Chandeliers. A live orchestra tuning in the far corner of the room. Designer gowns and the electricity of a night that the people attending it had been building toward for 4 years. The children of Chicago's most powerful families in one room, performing the version of themselves their parents had spent 2 decades curating. Warren Mercer was at the front table with the university donors and board members. He shook hands with the university president. He spoke to 3 men whose names appeared in the same business sections his name appeared in. He was comfortable here. He had always been comfortable in rooms like this one. He had built rooms like this one. He glanced across to Soleil's table. She looked fine. She had a drink in front of her. She was watching the room. He turned back to the conversation at his table. There was a deal structure to discuss and a board meeting coming up, and he was the kind of man who kept the thread of his professional life running even in social settings because that was what it meant to have built something that required his attention. He did not cross the room to sit with his daughter. He would do it later. At some point during the evening, he would find a natural break in the conversation and cross the room and spend some time with her. That was the plan. There was always a plan. The orchestra began. The floor filled. The first man who said no to asking Soleil was a business student named Marcus. He had borrowed her notes twice that year. Been friendly in the way of someone who was friendly to everyone. He came to the edge of the dance floor and looked in her direction, and his eyes dropped to the wheelchair and his path shifted slightly, and he turned and asked the girl standing nearest to him. Soleil kept her face still. The second was a man she did not know well, tall, confident, making his way around the edge of the floor with the energy of someone looking for a partner. He caught her eye from across the room and smiled, started walking toward her, got within 10 feet. She watched his eyes find the chair, watched his path adjust, just a degree, just enough, and he turned left and asked someone nearby instead. Soleil looked at the table in front of her. Then Trey walked in. She saw him before he saw her. He came in with a group she did not recognize. Laughing at something someone had said, comfortable, moving through the room with the ease of someone who had not left anything heavy behind. He looked good. He looked like someone whose life had continued in a straight line. He turned and saw her. 2 years of absence lived in that look. His eyes moved away. Deliberately. Completely. He turned back to his group and kept talking like she was not in the room he was standing in. Like she had never been anywhere he had been. Soleil put her right hand in her pocket. The flower was still there. Pressed flat. 4 years old. Still there. She had put it there that morning without thinking about it. The same way she always did on the days she expected to be looked through. She held it in her palm now and looked at the dance floor full of people, and she was in the place you reach when you have stopped expecting anything different, and the stopping itself has become a kind of weight you carry without knowing you are carrying it anymore. Kendrick arrived late. His suit was clean and pressed and not expensive. He stood at the entrance to the ballroom and read the room the way he always read spaces, quickly, completely, finding where the power sat and where the edges were and who was being tolerated and who was being celebrated. He saw Soleil almost immediately, alone at her table near the dance floor, hands in her lap, the floor around her full of people who were not her. He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the bar, about a corner somewhere and the minimum number of minutes before it was acceptable to leave. He thought about 4 years of eating alone and arriving at classes and leaving classes and building a careful invisibility that had kept him safe in a place that was not built for him. And then he thought about what crossing that floor would actually cost. Not just exposure. Not just the discomfort of being seen. This was a room full of the people who had spent 4 years deciding he did not belong here. If he walked to that table and she looked away, if she did not want this, if he had misjudged, if the moment collapsed in front of 300 people who had never once made space for him, there was no recovering from it quietly. He would become the story, the scholarship kid who overstepped, the South Side boy who thought he could cross a floor in a room like this one and not pay for it. He knew this. He stood at the entrance and he knew this completely. He thought about Thomas, a carpenter who built things with his hands until his heart gave out, who had died at 41 having never once stood in a room like this one, who had spent his whole life building things for a city that never learned his name, who had never, not once, walked past a need because the cost of meeting it was too visible. He thought about Darlene's voice on the phone that afternoon. The last day is the one people remember. Kendrick straightened his jacket. He crossed the floor. He walked past the people who had never invited him to anything and past the people who had borrowed his energy from across the room for 4 years without offering any back. He walked to the table near the edge of the dance floor and he stood in front of Soleil Diane Mercer and she looked up at him. "I don't really know how to do this." He held her gaze. "But would you like to dance?" She looked at him, and something moved through her face. Not slowly, in pieces, but all at once. The library, the hallways, the orientation desk 4 years ago, the flower arrangement and the 30 seconds she had been carrying since. "You picked up a flower for me once." Her voice was steady. "At orientation. You probably don't remember." He went completely still. "I kept it." 3 seconds of silence that felt like 4 years of everything that had happened in the space between. She looked at the dance floor, then back at him, She had not been looked at like this, directly, without arrangement, without the careful performance of normal, in a very long time. And she understood in her body before she understood in her mind that saying yes to this was not just saying yes to a dance. It was saying yes to being visible again in a room that had spent the evening teaching her to expect refusal. It was saying yes to hoping again, which was its own form of courage now, after everything hoping had cost her. She gripped the flower so tightly in her pocket. Yes. A breath, then steadier. I would like to dance. Tell me what you need. No performance in it. Just the question, direct and honest, from a man who had spent 4 years learning to solve problems by understanding them first rather than assuming. She looked at him for a moment. She was checking. She was always checking now, reading faces quickly, the habit of 2 years of learning to assess how much space she was being given before deciding how much to take. What she saw in his face was nothing but the question. No discomfort arranged into patience. No calculation. Just, tell me what you need. She told him how to position his hands on the handles, how to move with the chair rather than pushing against it, how to follow her lead with the upper body because she was the one who knew this body and what it could and could not do. He listened the way his father had listened when someone showed him a new technique, completely filing every detail, asking one quiet clarifying question and then going still to absorb the answer. Okay, let's figure it out. What followed was not perfect. It was awkward in the first few beats, both of them adjusting, both of them recalibrating. He moved the chair forward and she corrected the angle with a tilt of her shoulders and he found it and they started again. Then Soleil laughed. A real laugh. The unplanned kind that sounds different from polite laughter because it is not performing anything and it cannot be made to stop. The kind that has a person's whole body in it, her shoulders, her head tilting back, the particular light that comes into a face when the body has decided something is genuinely, unguardedly funny. The kind that had not come out of her in a very long time. Maybe since before. Maybe since the kitchen in her father's house on a Saturday morning when the radio was on and none of this had happened yet. The orchestra conductor heard it. He watched them for 8 bars. Then he slowed the tempo. Not dramatically. Not calling attention to the adjustment. Just gently, quietly, giving them more room. The conversations near the edge of the floor were the first to stop. People turning to look. Then the conversations closer in. Then a stillness spreading through the room in waves. The way silence spreads when something real is happening and the body registers it before the mind decides whether to pay attention. At the front table, Warren Mercer stopped mid-sentence. He looked across the room at his daughter. At the way she was laughing. At her arms moving and her head tilting back and the particular quality of joy in her face that he realized with a slow and terrible clarity he had not seen since before the diagnosis, since before the wheelchair, since before he had started doing everything he could think of to fix what had happened to her. Opening every door, removing every obstacle, solving every logistical problem the world put in her path, while somehow never doing the one thing that might have actually helped. He had spent 2 years solving around the wound. He had never entered it. He had never once sat down across from her and said, "Not the practical thing. Tell me the thing that is actually hard." He stood up from his chair. He did not make a decision to stand. He simply found himself on his feet. In the middle of the room, Trey stood with his drink in his hand and watched the dance happen. He had not touched the drink in several minutes. It was just something to hold. He did not move. He did not speak. Something was happening in his chest that he did not have a name for. Not guilt exactly, something worse than guilt. This feeling of watching someone else do the thing you had told yourself was impossible and understanding in your body that it was not impossible at all. That you had simply chosen not to do it. That the reason you left was not the wheelchair and not the diagnosis and not the changed future. The reason you left was that staying required you to be someone you had not become yet and you had chosen the door instead. The proof of that was standing on the dance floor in a suit that cost less than Trey's shoes. His expression changed for a moment. His face could tell he was getting annoyed. He looked at his drink. He looked at the floor. He could not quite look at either for long. Near the back of the room, Soleil's roommate from freshman year stood with her hand over her mouth. She had been at the registration desk directly beside Soleil's on orientation day 4 years ago, the adjacent line close enough to watch everything. She had seen a boy bend down and pick up a flower and hand it back without making anything of it. She had thought about it once or twice over the years without knowing why it had stayed with her. Just a small thing, just a moment, just a boy who acted like decency was the obvious default. She was the first one to start clapping. She did not know about the pressed flower in Soleil's pocket. She just remembered a boy who had been kind on the first day, in the small uncalculated way that real kindness usually is, and she recognized him crossing the floor and giving 4 years later what he had given in 30 seconds at orientation. Then the room. 300 people on their feet. Warren Mercer clapped with everyone else and felt something move through him that was not pride and was not satisfaction and was not anything he had a comfortable word for. Something older than those things and harder. Something that had been sitting in a room in his chest for 2 years without him acknowledging it was there. It was shame. For every room he had built. For every door he had opened with money and every obstacle he had removed and every logistical problem he had solved, while the one thing his daughter actually needed, to be chosen, simply and completely chosen, by someone who had nothing to gain from choosing her, had never once appeared on any of his balance sheets. He had given her the best of everything except the thing that cost nothing and meant everything. And a young man from Englewood in a suit that cost less than one of Warren's dress shirts had given it to her in the time it took to cross a dance floor that Warren himself had been sitting 30 feet from all evening. The music ended. The room was still for a moment before the applause continued. Kendrick walked her back to her table. She reached into her pocket. The flower, pressed flat, the color slightly faded, for years older than the day it fell. She held it out to him on her open palm. "I think you should have this back." Her voice was steady and quiet. "You gave it to me when I needed it, and you didn't even know you were doing it." He looked at it lying in his palm. Something thin and fragile and 4 years old. "I didn't remember." "I know." The smallest smile with something enormous behind it. "That's why I kept it." He looked at the flower. He looked at her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then, "I used to think the worst part of the diagnosis was losing my legs." She looked at the dance floor, still full of people. "But it wasn't. The worst part was learning how many rooms were never built for me in the first place. I've been working on that. Not in rooms like this. In Englewood." She froze, her eyes fixed on him. "Tell me." He told her about the proposal. The infrastructure project. The communities that kept receiving the worst version of everything the city built. The years of work he had put into designing something better. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she reached down to the portfolio bag leaning against her chair and took out a document. She set it on the table between them. Her architecture thesis. The community center. Englewood. They looked at each other across the table in the middle of a room full of people celebrating, and neither of them said anything for a long time. They had been building the same thing. In the same place. For the same people. For 4 years. Without ever comparing notes. Warren found Kendrick near the exit before he reached the door. He did not reach for his checkbook. He did not position himself as someone doing a favor. He just stood in front of this young man in his clean-pressed suit and asked the question that had been forming in him since he stood up from his chair. "How did you know how to do that?" Kendrick looked at the man whose company name was on half the buildings he had spent 4 years studying in civil engineering. "I didn't know anything." Unhurried and direct. "I just saw someone sitting alone and I didn't want to be someone who walked past." Warren was quiet for a moment. "My daughter has been sitting alone in rooms full of people for 2 years. A pause that held the full weight of it. "I built every one of those rooms." He let that land. Not as a rhetorical device. As a confession. "I thought I was protecting her. I thought opening the doors and removing the obstacles and making sure the path was clear was the same thing as being present. It is not the same thing. I understand that now." Kendrick said nothing. "What is your name?" Kendrick told him. "What are you going to do after tonight?" Kendrick told him everything. Englewood. The proposal. The years of work. Thomas, who had built things with his hands until his body gave out at 41. Warren listened to all of it without a word. "Send me the proposal." He reached into his jacket pocket and held out a card. Kendrick took it. They shook hands. That was all. Kendrick drove straight from the Harwick Hotel to Darlene's apartment on the south side. Still in his suit, the flower in his jacket pocket. The city moving past the windows of his car in the particular way Chicago moves past you late at night. The lights and the empty intersections and the skyline getting smaller as you move south and the streets getting more familiar the closer you get to the neighborhood that made you. He arrived after midnight and knocked twice, and Darlene opened the door and read his face before he said a word. She had been reading his face since he was 11 years old. She knew every configuration of it. She knew what this one meant. Something good. Something that had cost him something to carry all the way home. She stepped back. He came in. She went to the kitchen. He sat down at the table. The same table where she had paid bills after he went to sleep and written checks she was not sure would clear, and cried once in the year after Thomas died when she thought both boys were asleep. The table where she had told him about the scholarship and pressed both his hands between hers. She set food in front of him and sat down across from him and waited. He told her everything. The ballroom. The flower at orientation 4 years ago. The 30 seconds he had forgotten completely. The flower she had been carrying in her pocket across 4 years of university. The 3 men who had looked away. The man who had not been a stranger. The one who had held her hand in a hospital and then decided she was too much. The crossing of the floor and what it cost him and what it felt like and what she had said when he stood in front of her. The dance. The conductor slowing the tempo. The room going quiet. The man at the front table standing up without deciding to stand. The conversation at the exit. The name on the buildings. I built every one of those rooms. The proposals. The same block. The same corner of Englewood. Darlene listened to all of it and did not say a word until he was finished. The kitchen was silent for a while after he stopped talking. Outside, the south side was doing what it always did at this hour. Not empty but resting. The neighborhood breathing. He picked up his fork. Set it down. I wish Dad could have seen it. His voice broke slightly on the last word. Just slightly. Just enough to be the truth. Darlene reached across the table. Her hand, rough from 22 years of other people's floors, the knuckles slightly swollen the way hands get when they have been worked for decades, covered his. She did not speak immediately. She just held his hand and let the kitchen hold them both. Then, baby, he saw every bit of it. Kendrick looked at her. She squeezed his hand once. Then she let go and picked up her coffee cup. Now eat your food before it gets cold. He laughed. A real one, quick and unguarded, and picked up his fork. He did not leave until almost 2 in the morning. She stood in the doorway and watched him walk to his car, and did not go back inside until his tail lights turned the corner and disappeared. She lay in the dark and thought about Thomas. About the carpenter and the engineer. About the South Side apartment and the grand ballroom and the distance between them that Kendrick had covered on his own 2 feet without anyone opening the door. She thought, we did something right. She thought, he sees every bit of it. The morning after the gala, Soleil opened her architecture thesis portfolio. She sat alone at her desk in the early morning light and looked at it, not as a document to be submitted, but as something finished. 4 years of thinking made visible. The community center. Every entrance, every corridor, every threshold built from the wheelchair up as the foundation rather than the afterthought. She had designed every inaccessible problem she had ever personally encountered out of the building entirely. The ramp was not beside the stairs. There were no stairs. She sat with it for a long time. Then she looked at the location she had chosen for the thesis building. Englewood. She closed the portfolio. She looked out the window at Chicago waking up below her. Then she thought about something she had not expected to think about. Not the building. Not her father. Not Kendrick. She thought about the flower. About what it meant that she had stopped carrying it. She had carried it for 4 years as proof that ordinary decency existed. As evidence, on the days the world looked like it might not contain any, that 30 seconds of it had once been real and had been hers. She had not carried it as sentimentality. She had carried it as documentation. And last night she had given it back. Which meant she no longer needed the proof. Which meant something had shifted in her. Not because one dance had fixed anything. Not because one person's decency erased 2 years of other people's absence. But because she had let herself hope again. She had said yes in a room that had trained her to expect refusal. She had opened a door she had quietly closed. The world had not ended. It had, in fact, held. Some things start before you know they have started. And some things end before you realize they were keeping you from beginning. She picked up her phone. 3 weeks after the gala, Warren Mercer was in the back of his car on the way to a site meeting on the north side. He stopped his driver. He asked him to drive through Englewood instead. His driver changed direction without comment. 20 years of working for this man had taught him when the decision was already made. Warren had never done this. In 30 years of building infrastructure across Chicago, he had signed contracts and approved proposals and moved money through communities like Englewood without once driving through them slowly enough to see what his decisions had produced. He needed to see what he could not unsee. That was the only question driving the car now. Not whether Englewood was neglected. He already knew it was. Not whether his company had participated in that neglect. The budget documents made that plain enough. The question was what exactly it looked like when you had driven past it from paper for 30 years and finally stopped. The roads changed as they moved south. Gradually, the way things change when resources have been distributed unevenly for long enough that the unevenness becomes structural. The tarmac got older. The patches got more frequent. Then the patches gave way to sections where the road had simply been left to deteriorate past the point where patching made sense. He looked at the roads. He had built roads. He knew what maintenance looked like and he knew what deferred looked like. The playground. Equipment so old the rust had been there for years, the kind that appears when nobody has been out to assess the condition because the assessment budget was assigned somewhere else. A child's swing with one chain intact and one chain hanging. A slide with a crack someone had patched with duct tape and not replaced. The bus stops. Poles with signs and nothing else. No shelters. He thought about the heated shelters in Lincoln Park with the real-time arrival displays. The difference between what this neighborhood had and what that one had was not the result of insufficient resources in the city budget. He had seen the city budget. The resources existed. He thought about Kendrick in the corridor of the Harwick Hotel telling him about his father. A carpenter who worked 6 days a week and died at 41. Who built things his whole life for a city that kept deciding his neighborhood was someone else's problem. Warren said nothing the entire drive. He arrived at his meeting 20 minutes late. He sat through it. He went back to his office and sat at his desk for a long time without opening anything. One chain hanging. You could not unsee one chain hanging. 6 weeks after the gala, 2 documents were on Warren's desk. Kendrick's infrastructure proposal on the left. 47 pages. Every number sourced. Every comparison documented. The kind of proposal built by someone who had been working on it for years before anyone would read it, because the work demanded it regardless. Soleil's architecture thesis on the right. 212 pages. A complete community center design built from a single principle. That accessibility was the foundation, not the footnote. The body the world had been designing around was now the body the building was designed for first. The same block, the same community, the same set of problems approached from 2 different disciplines by 2 people who had never compared notes. His daughter and the young man who had crossed a dance floor in 30 seconds that Warren had never crossed in 2 years. They had been building toward the same corner of Englewood. Independently, before the gala, before he knew either of their proposals existed. Before money or influence or the name Vertex Capital Group had anything to do with it. They had built it because it needed to be built. Not because someone with resources had decided it was worth building. He sat with that for a long time. Then something hit him that had not hit him before. Not during the gala, not during the Englewood Drive, not during any of the weeks of reflection in between. He had read his daughter's thesis. 212 pages. He had read it with the careful attention he gave to every significant document that crossed his desk. He had noted its quality. He had felt proud. He had not once asked her about it while she was writing it. For years. She had been building something transformative for 4 years. Something that would outlast his portfolio. Something that addressed failures his own company had participated in. And in 4 years he had not once sat across from her and said, "Tell me what you are building. Tell me why Englewood. Tell me what you see that I don't." He had opened every door. He had not once opened a conversation. I just saw someone sitting alone and I didn't want to be someone who walked past. Warren had been walking past for 30 years. Not past Englewood. Past Soleil. The groundbreaking ceremony in Englewood was on a Thursday morning in March. Hard hat. Muddy ground. The kind of cold Chicago morning where the wind comes off the lake with a personal grievance and the sky is the flat gray that means it is serious about staying that way. Darlene Wallace was in the front row in the good coat she saved for occasions. The dark wool one she had bought on sale 8 years ago and kept in the back of the closet for the days that deserved it. Standing straight. Hands folded in front of her. Eyes on her son. City officials in their own hard hats. A small camera crew from the local news. Aldermen who had written letters of support once the funding came through. And the residents, the people who actually lived here, who had been living here while the rest of the city decided what Englewood deserved and kept deciding wrong. Some of them with their arms folded against the cold. Some of them with children on their shoulders so the kids could see over the crowd. An older woman in a heavy coat who had lived on this block for 40 years and had watched things get built and watched things get torn down and was here to see what this one turned out to be. Kendrick stood with a shovel in his hands and looked out at all of it. Beside him, Soleil. Her own shovel resting across the arms of her chair. Her hard hat slightly too large, her chin lifted against the cold. Her community center was going up on the same block. Same ground. Same morning. When the approvals came through she had called him and said I want the same date and he had said I already asked for it. They had not talked about what that meant. They did not need to. Kendrick found Darlene in the front row. She was already looking at him. She nodded once, the kind that contains everything without performing any of it. He nodded back. In the back of the crowd, standing apart from the officials and the camera crew, not near any of the people who would appear in the photographs, Warren Mercer. Not Vertex Capital Group. Not a donor at a groundbreaking. Just a man in a dark coat in the back of a crowd in a neighborhood he had driven through once in 30 years. Standing in the back because the front was not his place, and he was finally beginning to understand the difference between funding something and being present for it. Kendrick saw him. Warren nodded. Kendrick nodded back. Soleil looked at the turned earth in front of her. The beginning of something that had not existed yesterday. She thought about the people who would use this building. Not abstractions. Specific people, people like her, people like Kendrick's father, people the city had been building around for decades instead of building for. People who had learned to navigate the gap between where they were and where the entrance had been put, who had learned to use the service elevator and the side ramp and the door that required 2 hands in a particular angle, who had learned that the built world was not built for them and had decided to survive that fact rather than fight it. This building would be different. Not as accommodation. As foundation. She thought about the flower she was no longer carrying. She gripped the shovel. The shovels went into the ground. Nobody moved for a moment. Not the officials. Not the camera crew. Not the residents on the sidewalk or the children on their parents' shoulders. Just a half second where the shovels were in the ground and the ceremony had completed and nobody had decided yet what the right response was. Because what had just happened was not a ribbon cutting or a press event or a funding announcement. It was something older and harder to name than any of those things. It was people who had been told no by the city for decades putting something into the ground themselves and saying, "This is ours regardless." The older woman in the heavy coat who had lived on this block for 40 years started clapping first. Then the people around her. Then the children on their parents' shoulders. Then the officials and the aldermen and the camera crew. And what the crowd was applauding, what the older woman and the children on shoulders and the residents with their arms folded against the cold were applauding, was not a developer's investment or an institution's charity or a billionaire deciding a neighborhood was worth his attention. What they were applauding was 2 overlooked people who had built something before power decided to notice them. Who had done the work in private for years, who had refused to wait for permission, who had decided that the place they came from and the people the city kept getting wrong deserved the same standard as everywhere else, and had sat down at a kitchen table and a drafting desk and made that decision real. The grand ballroom of the Harwick Hotel felt very small from here. Darlene Wallace stood in the front row with her hands pressed together and her eyes full and her chin up and watched her son put a shovel in the ground. In the back, Warren Mercer clapped quietly and looked at the turned earth and did not try to make himself the story of this moment. He had a lot to answer for. He was going to spend the rest of his life answering for it. Today he was going to stand in the back and let the people who had built this before he showed up stand at the front. It was a start. It was the least he could do. And he understood now, finally, the difference between those two things. Warren Mercer watched his daughter be invisible in rooms he built for 2 years and did nothing. Then a young man from Englewood crossed a floor in 30 seconds that Warren had never crossed. Some people say "Send Me the Proposal" was exactly right. Dignified, respectful, allowing Kendrick to stand on his own terms rather than being absorbed into someone else's power. Others say a man worth $2.3 billion who watched his daughter suffer that long, who built the rooms that excluded her without once stopping to ask what she needed, owed far more than a business card moment. Both arguments are real. Neither one is the question that will stay with you longest. The question that stays is this. Kendrick was not exceptional in what he did. He crossed a floor. He asked a question. He listened to the answer. He was not a hero. He was just a person who decided in one moment that he was not going to be someone who walked past. That decision is available to everyone in any room. Most people in that ballroom did not make it. Not because they were cruel. Because it was easier not to. Because the distance between where they were standing and where she was sitting had a social cost attached to it, and they had quietly decided the cost was not worth paying. You have been in rooms like that. You may be in one right now. The floor is still there. If the story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Storytelling Empire. New stories every week. See you in the next one.